I want to tell you about the year I stopped explaining myself. I am 87. For most of my life, I believed that if I could only find the right words and set them in the right order, people would finally understand why I do what I do. So I explained. I explained my choices, my quiet, my empty chair at the table, my closed door on a Sunday afternoon. Last winter, I sat by the stove and counted the things I had spent years explaining to people who had already made up their minds. There were 7. When I finished that list, I did not feel ashamed, and I did not feel proud. I felt honest, maybe for the first time in years. Come closer to the fire. Sit down where the heat reaches you. I am not telling you that I stopped loving the people who asked me those questions. I did not go cold and I did not slam any doors. I am not telling you to keep secrets either, because a closed heart is a poor way to spend your last good years. What I am telling you is smaller than that and harder. Every explanation I offered was a small payment I made for the right to be myself. I had been paying that toll for 60 years without once asking who was collecting it. My grandmother had a way of ending an argument without ever raising her voice. She would set down whatever she was holding, look at the person a long moment, and go back to her work. When I was a boy, this made me furious. I asked her once why she never defended herself when the neighbors talked about her. She was pulling a shawl thread through her fingers, and she said, "A river does not stop to explain itself to the stones. It goes on being a river, and in time the stones are shaped by it." I did not understand her then. I thought silence was surrender. It took me until my 80s to see it plain. She was not surrendering. She was continuing. My grandfather said the same thing with fewer words. He said, "What you defend, you make heavy." So let me give you the first confession. For 11 years, I explained why I live alone. My son Eli would come up the road every few months, and before his boots were off, he would start in. He would look at the drying rack, 1 plate, 1 cup, 1 fork, and he would say, "There is a good place in town, people your age, card games on Thursday." And I would begin my speech. I had it worn smooth as a river stone by then. I would tell him about the light through the east window at 6 in the morning. I would tell him about the sound the pines make when the wind comes down off the ridge. I would tell him I had buried his mother from this house and meant to leave it the same way. He would nod. He would look at the drying rack again. My grandfather used to say, "You cannot hand a man your eyes." 11 years I tried. One October I simply said, "I know," and poured him coffee instead. He stayed 4 hours. It was the best visit we ever had. Let me set one thing down beside you before I go on. I gathered these teachings into a small book, The Native Way, 20 of them for the later years. The link is in the description below. Read one and sit with it overnight. No pressure at all. I am here at this fire whether you ever open it or not. I say that plainly because I have watched men my age turn every conversation into a sales counter, and I would rather be your elder than your merchant. What is in those pages is only what my grandmother put into me and what the years have sanded down since. If your heart wants it, it is there waiting. If it does not, then sit here anyway, because the fire is the same size either way and you are welcome at it. Now, let me give you the second confession. The second confession is the telephone. For years I explained why I do not answer it on the first ring. My daughter would call from 400 miles away and let it ring 11 times, and when I called her back that evening she would be wounded, and I would explain. I would tell her I was in the garden. I would tell her my hands were in the dirt, or in the bread, or under the sink with a wrench. All of it was true and none of it was the reason. The reason is that a ringing telephone tells an old man he is late for something, and I have spent enough of my life being late. I was late to my own father's last afternoon. I have never been in a hurry since, and I could not say that to her without opening a door I did not want opened on a Tuesday. So I said, "The garden." My grandmother said, "The flower does not open because you are standing there waiting on it." What I do now is simpler than any explanation. I call her back every evening at 7, without fail, whether there is news or not. She has stopped counting the rings entirely. She got more of me by asking for less of me, and neither of us ever had to say a word about it. The third confession is the truck. I sold it at 84, and for 2 years afterward I explained why to anybody who would hold still long enough. I would talk about my eyes. I would talk about the deer that come down onto the county road at dusk in November. I would talk about what the insurance had gotten to. Every word of it was reasonable, and every word of it was a fence I was building around the true thing, which is that I had become frightened, and that I would rather stop while stopping was still my own idea and not somebody else's decision made for me in a doctor's office. That is not a shameful thing. But I could not say it out loud, so I gave them reasons instead. My grandfather said, "A pine that bends in the ice storm is still standing come spring. It is the ones that will not give that come down." The neighbors never needed my reasons anyway. Walter up the hill drove me into town every second Wednesday for 3 years, and not one time did he ask me why I had sold it. He would just put the heater on my side and talk about his beans. The fourth confession is the Saturday suppers. I went for 41 years. Then I stopped going, and I spent an entire season explaining that. I told them it was my knees. I told them it was the drive back in the dark. The truth is that I had begun to feel like a chair somebody keeps in the corner because moving it out would seem unkind. Everyone was good to me. That is what made it so hard to say. There is no way to tell a room full of decent people that their kindness has started to feel like an arrangement. So I said knees, and they said knees back to me, and we all went on. My grandmother said, "The leaf does not apologize to the branch in October." When I finally told Samuel the real reason, plain, with no softening on it, he was quiet a long while. Then he said he had felt exactly the same thing for 2 years and had never found anybody to say it to. We have breakfast now, the two of us, every Wednesday at the counter in town. It is better than those suppers ever were, and it came from one true sentence. The fifth confession is the past. For most of my adult life, I explained my own history to people who had already written their version of it. There was a falling out in my family, 40 years back now, and at every gathering I would find some corner and lay the whole thing out again, the order of events. Who said what, and in what tone, and what I had actually meant by it. I told myself I was seeking peace. I was not. I was seeking a verdict, and there is no court that sits for a thing like that. My grandfather said, "The canyon wind carries every word you ever shouted into it, and it does not bring one of them back to you." I have set that down now. I do not argue the past. I do not correct the record when somebody tells it wrong at a table. It is the single heaviest thing I ever put down, and I will tell you something strange about it. My shoulders knew it was gone before my mind did. I slept 11 hours the night after. The sixth confession is my daughter, and it is the one I am least proud of. When she chose a life I had not imagined for her, I explained my disappointment to her. Never cruelly. That is almost worse than cruel. I did it gently, reasonably, with such evident care, over years, in small remarks about practical matters, about whether she had thought this or that through. I believed I was being honest with my own child. What I was doing was applying pressure with a soft hand, and a soft hand can press for a very long time before anybody in the room is willing to call it pressure. My grandmother said, "The seed does not need your opinion. It needs the ground left alone." So I left the ground alone. It took me a year to learn to say nothing on that subject, and it was the hardest silence of the 7. The day I finally managed it all the way through a visit, she called me that same week for no reason at all, just to tell me a thing she had seen on the road. Do you know how long it had been since my own child called me with no reason? The seventh confession is the porch light, and it is the most important of them all. I leave it burning every night. For years, when anybody asked, I explained it away. I said it was for the steps. I said it was the raccoons in the bins, or the propane man coming early. The real reason is that my wife left that light on for 46 years, so that anybody out in the dark would know this house was awake. I keep it on because I am still keeping her promise for her, and because I do not know who is driving past at 11 at night with something heavy sitting in their chest. That is not a reason a man can hand to somebody over a fence. My grandfather said, "Some things you do not explain, you just keep doing them until somebody notices." Last spring, a young man I had never met knocked on that door near midnight. He said he had been passing that light for the better part of a year. He sat at my table until 2 in the morning, and I never once explained the light to him. I just kept the coffee coming. He did most of the talking. Somewhere around 1 o'clock he told me what he had come about, and it was the sort of thing a young man cannot say to anyone who loves him, which is exactly why he needed a stranger's kitchen to say it in. I did not give him any counsel. I am not sure I had any worth giving. When he stood up to go, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at that bulb over the steps, and he said, "You leave it on for a reason." And I said, "Yes." That was the whole of it. 40 years of practiced explanations, and the only one that ever landed was a single word said at 2 in the morning to a man whose name I still do not know. Now, I want to be careful here, because naming these 7 was not the same as hating myself for them. That is a trap I have watched men my age walk straight into. They make a list of their failings, and then they move into that list and live in it, and they call the living there wisdom. It is not wisdom. It is only a new way to stay busy with yourself. Every one of those 7 explanations came out of something decent in me. I explained because I wanted to be known. That is not a character flaw. That is the oldest hunger there is, and it does not retire when you do. The mistake was never in the wanting. The mistake was in the address. I kept carrying that hunger to people who were not able to receive it, and then I called their inability my own failure, and so I tried harder and explained more, and the whole thing went around again like a mule at a mill. What I did last winter at that stove was not a confession of guilt. It was an accounting. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is everything. A man can look plainly at what he has done without deciding that he is rotten for having done it. My grandmother could do that better than anyone I ever knew. She would see a thing clearly, name it one time, and then go back to her work, and the naming would do its own quiet labor while her hands stayed busy. So let me gather this up for you now, the way my grandmother gathered the ends of her shawl. 7 things I stopped explaining. Why I live alone. Why I do not answer on the first ring. Why I sold the truck at 84. Why I left the Saturday suppers after 41 years. What happened in this family 40 years ago. My disappointment in my daughter's good and chosen life. And the porch light I will keep burning until somebody else has to turn it off for me. Now I will turn it toward you. Because you did not sit down at this fire to hear an old man take inventory of himself. What are you still explaining? Who exactly are you explaining it to? And how long has that person been decided? And when you say those words one more time tonight, ask yourself honestly whether they are truly for their understanding or whether they are for your own permission. I know what some of you are asking me right now, because I asked it of myself at that stove with the list lying in front of me. Is it too late for me? You are 70 or 80, and you have been explaining yourself so long that the explaining has come to sound like your own natural voice. Here is the only thing I can tell you honestly. I cannot promise you what will come of it. I do not know what your daughter will do, or whether your neighbor will ever understand you. What I do know is that age has not taken from you the ability to notice one thing you are still explaining, and to make one ordinary choice about it. That much is still yours tonight. It was still mine at 87. I would like to hear from you now. Of the 7, tell me which number sat closest to your own chest tonight, and say it plain in the comments. I read them all, and I sit with them a good while longer than you would think an old man would, and then come back tomorrow. I will be right here at this same fire, and the light will be on out front the way it always is. Stay a while.